Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
I think so. Yeah, I did.
Let's double check it.
No, it started. It's fine. There we go. Alrighty.
Ready to go?
Yeah, I think so.
Everything is okay?
Yes, I think so.
No mai, haere mai, whakato mai rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Nick Smith and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, and it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome colleagues from around the university, our alumni and invited guests to talk about a topic which I think is important for not just the two hosting faculties, business and economics and engineering, not the university as a whole, but I think society in general, the future of work. And it's always an additional pleasure when we get to welcome back somebody we can claim as one of our own. Andrew Grant is an alumni of this university. He completed a Bachelor of Civil Engineering with first class honours before being awarded a Rhodes Scholarship and completing a master's degree in politics, philosophy and economics. And this is, for those who know it, the home stamping ground of young Renaissance men and women, and also something which correlates with often becoming a Prime Minister of an important country, whether it's UK, New Zealand or Australia. Andrew chose not to take that route, but he is somebody who leaders of government have listened to on this topic for some time. He's brought a nuanced, articulate and I think quite compelling vision which contrasts with what we often hear in the media, that the robots are coming to take our jobs, and talking about how do we link interventions in early childhood right through to professional careers. What kinds of technological changes really make an impact at the level of society, and what does that mean for how we live, work, communicate and play? For all these reasons, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Andrew back to the university, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
I don't know if I need this. Can you hear me reasonably well if I speak? Just very good. Let's try. Well, look, it really is an absolute privilege to be with very good friends like Jason, and to be what I certainly consider my own home. I'm also incredibly grateful when I look back over all the years in terms of what a degree from this school equipped me with. I really do feel that the pedagogy, the learning, the teaching has actually stood me in incredibly good stead. Other than one moment, when I do remember being a very earnest young New Zealand Rhodes Scholar arriving at Oxford with my engineering degree in my pocket, thinking that I was equipped to take on the world. In my first attempt at Oxford, writing and then reading to the tutor my first attempt at empirical philosophy. And I remember reading this essay very clearly to the tutor, quite proud of my efforts. I think I even slipped in an equation from structures that I'd learned, so I was sort of quite proud of this hybridisation of different teaching disciplines. Only for my tutor to at the end read the essay, sort of tip his glasses and look at me and go, "So you're here to play rugby, then are you, Grant?" Got a good introduction to, there was a little bit of a transition period. I also feel incredibly privileged to, again, be with you here today and be sharing some research. The organisation that I'm part of, McKinsey Company, we do have the privilege of spending about $1 billion a year on research and development. And I know for fine institutions like the University of Auckland, $1 billion can go a long way when it comes to an academic budget or a research and development budget. But we do have the privilege of having a reasonably sizable research and development budget. And I'll share with you just one place where we've put a considerable amount of that money and are continuing to invest. to really provide some perspectives and some insights in terms of the topic of artificial intelligence and the future of work, to try and calibrate what is going to be the magnitude, what will be some of the valuable problems that we need to solve, what will really be some of the real opportunities, and also a little bit to try and, as it were, provide a fact base and just some thinking in an area where it's fair to say there have been some pretty extreme comments made by some very intelligent people. So Stephen Hawking said that artificial intelligence really is the existential threat for humanity. Elon Musk paints a world of a Skynet world where we really will be taken over by the machines and the aliens. These are not unintelligent people. These are thoughtful, successful people that are making some pretty significant, call them outlandish claims in terms of what artificial intelligence and the future of work is likely to be. So what I'd like to share with you today is, again, and it's very much in the spirit of one beggar showing other beggars where there's food. We have put in the research and the thinking, but I think everyone needs to approach this the subject with a degree of humility, and there are just some unknown unknowns that we just don't quite know exactly the pathway that all of this is going to take us in. But I would also contend, and what I'd like to share with you this evening, is that we do have some parameters, we do have some, I think, some dimensioning and some guardrails in terms of the magnitude of the challenges before us, and also some of the opportunities that I believe are in front of us. Throughout this, I'd also like a large theme to come through. I do think the opportunity for New Zealand is disproportionate. When you look at some of the opportunities that I will frame, I would argue that structurally we have many of the degrees of freedom, many of the structural attributes that actually mean this could provide for us a much larger opportunity than some other economies. And when you also look at the challenges that are going to be thrown up, I would argue that our smallness, our collaborative nature, the nature of just who we are as people, I think we have the opportunity actually to do something quite unique and something special on a global basis. I was quite struck. I shared a version of this material at Davos this year at the World Economic Forum. And I have to say this year, the only topic that was really discussed was the future of work. But I was quite struck by the quality of the debate around the problems, the quality of debate around sort of what's coming was extraordinary. The thoughtfulness and even the amount of thinking that's been done on what might be some of the solutions was, in my view, quite embarrassing, given the quality of the folk that were there in the thinking. And I think, again, the challenge I would be putting to you as New Zealanders, but also I do think the academic tradition at this university and some of our history of a nation of innovating around new institutions, I think we actually have an opportunity that we could really shine on and really provide quite a role model for the world in terms of what actually can be done. So let me explain and unpack a little bit more of that. So the first thing I think is just to calibrate a little bit in terms of when in human history we've seen not dissimilar events. And when you go back to the original Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century in the United Kingdom, and you compare it with what is actually going on today, the pace of what we are seeing in terms of technological development is about 10 times the pace and about 300 times the scale. Xi Jinping, the president of China, premier and also the arguably most powerful leader in China since Mao, recently in his address to the Party Congress last October, made a statement that we are truly living in historical times. When you actually look at the entire history of human history, the magnitude of change, the significance of what is occurring now actually really registers when you take that millennial, multi-millennial perspective on human history. So the pace and the scale of what is occurring now really is quite extraordinary when we look at human history. So I think we just often, when you're living in it, you don't often recognise the degree to which we are living in a pretty special moment in human history, with extraordinary scale and remarkable pace. What I'd like to share with you this evening is when it comes to AI and the future of work, and when I talk about AI and the future of work, clearly AI, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, that family of technologies, complemented by robotics, by digital, by different sensing technologies. I'm really talking about AI at the core, but I'm being quite inclusive of the, as it were, the entire family of next generation technologies that are really supporting that. Obviously, the technology is anchored by three significant, the three most significant technologies, we would argue, are AI, are machine learning, and obviously deep learning, which is a form of machine learning. Those end up being the core, but around that again, there are all of these other enabling technologies. So just for the, as it were, the academically precise, which I know most, if not all of you are, just in terms of language, I'm using a very broad interpretation of the disruption being brought about by AI at the centre, but also the suite of technologies that are working in an interdependent way with AI. And the argument that certainly McKinsey Company makes globally is there are three important implications for the economy and for society more broadly when it comes in and around AI and the future of work. One is around productivity. One about the productivity engine that is driving our economy. Secondly is around employment and how we will actually see employment unfold. And thirdly is around inequality and how we actually believe inequality might pan out. And I'm going to tell for you this evening a very good story, a neutral story, and I would argue, quite a deeply concerning story. I will be sharing with you that on productivity, I think, and certainly McKinsey Company as an institution in our research would argue that actually AI in the future of work offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to restart the productivity engine that has been desperately lacking in nearly all advanced economies for about the last 30 years. And particularly, I'll explain, given the structure of the New Zealand economy, we have missed out on many of the technology improvements, well, certainly the productivity dividend that has flown from a number of the significant technology developments of the last 30 years because of the structure of our economy. But AI in the future of work actually offers an opportunity that will go much deeper into our economic structure and really offers, as it were, a genuine opportunity, a once in a life, certainly a once in a post-war lifetime opportunity to restart productivity growth. On employment, I will share with you that in about 15 years, it will all be a wash. 15, 20 years, it will all be a wash in terms of AI in the future of work will create as many jobs as it destroys. The real challenge is going to be the transition and how we actually manage and navigate that transition. And there are some very encouraging scenarios, but some really concerning scenarios on how that transition is made. And I'll share with you, so in the end, as it were, the transition, the employment story around AI and the future of work is in our hands. But as it were, the range of the scenarios that will pan out are going to be quite significant. The concerning picture that I will paint this evening is around inequality. It looks, as much as we can establish, that the future of work will, as it were, destroy middle-income jobs and recreate high and low-income jobs. So structurally we end up, and it's not like we don't have an inequality problem today. So I will share with you in terms of just some thinking about what we might do with that, but I'll also share with you some of the research, just why we believe that that needs to be very, very high on the policy agenda in terms of just the nature of where the jobs are going to go and fall and be created actually structurally creates even more of a problem for us going forward. So those are the three, and then I'll share with you some solutions. But starting with this picture, and I've done that, I'm showing you here for Australia and New Zealand combined. I'm doing that just partly to make the Australians feel good. We make their numbers look better than they are without New Zealand in the mix. But if you look at, for those of you, you will know that economic growth is fundamentally driven by two things. Population growth that then feeds into workforce growth and underlying productivity growth. And when we look back historically, if you look certainly over the last 20 years, you can see that on average GDP growth has been 3.2% for Australia and New Zealand. That's been made up of 1.8%, so more than half of that has been made up due to productivity growth, and a little less than half, 1.4%, is made up of employment growth. By the way, when you look at the mix in Australia, there's been a little bit more productivity growth and less employment growth. We've been exactly the reverse. In fact, productivity growth in New Zealand over the last 2 years has actually been zero. So as a nation, we really are utterly anemic when it comes to productivity growth. When we look forward, obviously demographically, we know we have a very good view of what's going to happen in and around employment growth. We certainly know demographically what's happening, and we can make some assumptions around immigration. And effectively, we know that employment growth is going to shrink, and a lot of productivity growth is also driven by R&D spend, by capital expenditure. So we have a pretty good view on what that's likely to be as well. And you can see that there's going to be a fall in just the underlying structural rate of GDP growth that will fall by about a quarter. And obviously that has a whole lot of implications in terms of, standards of living, wealth creation and such like going forward. So we actually have quite a problem. And in New Zealand, we have 4 structural factors that makes productivity growth in our economy and society quite problematic. Number 1 is we are a nation of small and medium business. 95% of New Zealand industry basically is a bloke-ass or a bloke that owns a job. So we really are a very small and medium-sized economy. Most of the big productivity improvement interventions that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years were really only available to the big end of town, to bigger firms. They were things like ERP, SAP R3, IT systems. They were some of the forms of automation that we've already seen. But your average small and medium-sized enterprise in New Zealand just wasn't able to afford that, didn't have the capability to deploy that. So they've largely missed out on that productivity growth that we've seen in many other economies over the last 20, 30 years. Now many people say, well, that's due to New Zealand's agricultural base. Well, it's actually not. We have the lowest productivity growth in the services sector in the OECD world. And part of that has been driven largely just by firm size. The second thing is we have very low R&D spend. Again, we're about 25 out of 26 in the OECD world. And again, we know R&D spend leads directly to this. Likewise, in terms of capital spend, very, very low in terms of the benchmarks. And also because we are a small place, it's hard to get competitive intensity into the nation just by different, you need firms to have minimum efficient scale. In a country of our size, it's very hard to get enough of those where you can actually create the competitive intensity that drives productivity growth. So for New Zealand, the opportunity that AI and the future of work offers, it really is a one-off opportunity to restart this productivity growth engine. Principally because most of the new techniques and the new technology that's available, and also because of some business system changes that we move to not asking firms to completely buy an entire AI system, but we can actually deliver it to them as a service. So a firm will face a variable cost rather than a large capital cost, which again means that a lot of this technology and these techniques will be available literally to you and I as individual consumers, but also to that small and medium-sized New Zealand firm. They will actually be able to access many of the most advanced technologies that are coming. So for New Zealand, this really offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that really can help shift things in our favour. In fact, it was interesting, one of the panels that I was part of at Davos this year, they argued that there are going to be two nations that are really going to benefit from AI and the future of work. One is, it was actually New Zealand, and they put us in with the Scandinavian, but small advanced economies that have had challenging productivity growth will be the nations that disproportionately benefit, and actually China. The reason for China, and I'll share another reason later, but the primary reason is the old Napoleon, I expect my generals not just to be good, but lucky. When you look at China with its demographic decline, as the impact of the one-child policy is really starting to bite, what AI and the future of work offers, they really do not face the labour market challenges that the US, that Europe, that many others happen. So for China, AI is happening at exactly the right time. And some of the things I'll talk about later in and around the ethics, the sort of stance that countries will be taking China is taking what we're calling a techno-utilitarian approach. Essentially, kind of as long as we can prove the greatest good for the greatest number, we'll drive the technology as hard as we possibly can, regardless of privacy concerns, regardless of some other concerns. So China really is actually setting up a geopolitical advantage around its preparedness to put the foot to the floor, and the massive advantage it has because it needs many of these things to make up for the demographic decline that it is going to face. So message number one, AI and the future of work, huge opportunity about restarting a productivity engine for which New Zealand, despite successions of governments, despite many minds, we just have not got ourselves out of first gear, maybe second gear if you're generous, in terms of building an economy that has a productivity engine that is thriving, that is growing, that is really progressing us to a better place as an economy. Also, and again, I apologise, this chart is a little, well, it's not, it's, let me explain in terms of what it's showing. That this shows you essentially employment, the size of, the number of, rather than just actual humans, we've used what we call full-time equivalents, so that you can actually incorporate part-time work and such like. But you can see from 2000 the historic growth of what employment has been. And then the grey line that continues is what would if we just took that historic line actually going back further and just extrapolated it into history going forward. The dotted grey line shows what happens to employment when the future of work and AI really kicks in, with no redeployment. And you can see we basically see a degradation of employment in 2030 back to levels in 2000. The solid light blue line assumes that what happens if we were to keep everyone employed. The dotted line actually shows what happens if we actually redeploy these people using AI in the future of work to the full extent. And you can see that we actually get a boost that actually takes us on track or even slightly above what would be that historical growth rate, including the employment growth that we saw. So you can see a pretty stark picture in terms of if we do nothing, we end up in a pretty ugly scenario, and I'll paint more starkly what that means for families, what that means for support levels, what that means for our, as it were, our social welfare structure if we find ourselves in that post-displacement world, and also some of the new jobs that could be created, again, if we actually really leverage automation to provide the boost and the opportunity kicker that it could be. Now, one important consideration about the nature, now technology taking jobs and technology, as it were, reshaping the nature of employment, nothing new about that. Again, that's been around since the original industrial revolution back in the late 18th century. There is a unique feature about what is happening with this technological revolution. And that is, historically, automation tended to take out whole jobs at a time. You replace an entire job with automation or with some systems change. What we're finding about the nature of this technology shift is that it takes out tasks, not whole jobs. It takes out tasks, not whole jobs. So we're actually going to see, yes, some jobs do add up that we take out all of the tasks. There are a few jobs that are quite resilient, but actually the majority for all of us is we're actually going to see what we do fundamentally. So as it were, our jobs aren't going to go away, but they will be fundamentally changed. And actually in some careers we'll end up having an underemployment problem. As it were, that 60% of our job will remain and will be quite resilient to further erosion from automation taking over tasks. But we'll have to be thoughtful about what do we replace the 40% with? How do we create a new model going forward? But the way that we think about the tasks and the way we've modelled the impact that AI is likely to have, we look at essentially 7 different classes of tasks. Management tasks, expertise tasks, so graphic designers or structural engineers, interface folk, real estate agents, stockbrokers, people that are at the interface of markets, Those that are undertaking unpredictable physical work, so folk in healthcare, folk building roads, folk in construction, where you can't actually, you're not in the manufactured environment, there's an unstructured and unpredictable dimension to the physical work. Then also those that collect data. That might be traffic survey data, that might be stock market data, that might be, again, real estate transaction data. Those that process data in terms of folk that are, again, data process controllers, call centre data managers. And then predictable physical work. So those in the manufactured environment, those in building materials environments, those in assembly, and the like. And what this chart shows is in the blue for the bar charts, that's the amount of those tasks that we believe can be automated economically and technologically today. So literally it makes economic sense and all of the technology exists to do it today. And you can see that in the blue, so for example in terms of management tasks, so in terms of if you're a dean, if you're a chief executive, the management task, only 8% in New Zealand can be taken out. In Australia, 6%. I did ask my team why the difference between Australia and New Zealand. They said, oh, very simple, it's all down to the difference in IQ. I didn't understand which way the equation actually went, however, in terms of... but again, you can see that the yellow bar is Australia, the blue bar New Zealand, and then the number is actually the time spent in all occupations. And so, for example, in Australia, 8% of all time and tasks is spent in management. In New Zealand, that's 10. And again, the bar, the numbers actually add up to 100 when you add up all the tasks across the economy. So again, simple way. Obviously, the more you get towards more manual, more predictable tasks, the more share you can take those tasks out. And again, you see the difference across the Australian and New Zealand economy. The reason for the difference is just largely to do with the structure of our economies. Australia just has a larger industrial and manufacturing base, so that just reflects largely the difference there. And a little bit in terms of we actually have, and they have a larger public sector than we do. So that explains the larger public sector, the larger manufacturing base, and there's some slight differences in just a mix in service sectors. We actually have a larger retail footprint, for example, and actually have larger educational services in Australia. But those are, on a global scale, we're actually very close relative to many other economies. But that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the underlying methodology of how we've come up with the conclusions that I'm going to share with you. It really is, in our view, about getting to the level, and then obviously below this, literally there are hundreds and thousands of individual tasks that we've gone and looked at and assessed, again, what is the implication for the technology that exists today to be able to make those changes. So when you rack that all up, what is the implication for jobs overall in terms of our economy, the Australian economy, and how does that stack up globally? So you can see that New Zealand, 41% of all jobs, when you rack up, can be automated today, economically and technologically. Australia, it's slightly higher percent. Again, that is largely driven by the manufacturing base. We're in the sort of league of the Norways of the world. Denmark, just because of a much higher service sector, is lower. The global average is 49%, we're a little lower than that. Mexico and India and China are self-evident in terms of the amount of predictable physical tasks going on there. People often look in Japan and say, listen, I don't quite understand, why is Japan so high? Japan is so high largely because of its it's labour-intensive manufacturing base, and actually a very labour-intensive service sector base with lots of repeatable tasks. If you've ever changed money in Japan, you'll get a sense of why this is a big opportunity in the Japanese service sector. So that just gives you a little bit of the overall picture in terms of how things are panning out. So when we then look, okay, how are the jobs going to be changed, destroyed, what new ones will be added, etc. Here's the picture that we paint in Australia and New Zealand. So we argue in Australia and New Zealand about 25%, and again, just the time frame here is important, through to 2030. In terms of in that time frame, we argue that about 25% of all jobs in Australia will be replaced by automation, 21% in New Zealand. And then you can see both in terms of the new jobs directly created by automation, but also the second order jobs that are created because of the demand effect. If you are more productive, you create more demand. Citizens then consume more services, which creates additional demand. You can see that additional demand effect. That essentially, both in Australia and New Zealand, around employment, for that about 15-year time frame, employment is largely a wash. So we actually net out in terms of the jobs. And if we look at the new jobs that get created, we look largely at 4 categories of jobs. What we call the creators and suppliers. So they would be robotics engineers, creators of machine learning algorithms, would be jobs that we see in the creator and supplier world. The largest is actually around the enablers. So these are user interface designers, designing the user interface design systems that enables the AI. The business translators, the data scientists that are actually translating the algorithms into usable insights. The utilisers of these, the people that are actually creating, as it were, the customer interface. That again, it might be a new banking app that has AI embedded in it. It might be a new traffic management app that again is being made user-friendly in a way that you can actually use it in a practical way on your way to work, on your way to the university. And then a whole range of other jobs. Interestingly, in others, a disproportionate number of academic jobs. The ethicists of the future. How do we deal with the embedded bias issues that machine learning is throwing up? But of the others, about 4% of them are academic jobs. So you're in the right profession in terms of some of the opportunities. Might have to change a little bit, but there are certainly employment opportunities that we see coming down the pipe. And again, that just gives you a little bit of sense of the overall magnitude of the jobs. About 500,000 new jobs in New Zealand, about 2.6 to 3 million jobs in Australia. So that's the good news about the employment story. The challenging, I've mislide ahead. The most important message around employment, however, is not so much the jobs that are created and destroyed. The bigger story is actually around the way jobs will actually be changed. And the way all of our, to some extent, the way we spend our lives will actually be fundamentally changed, and the nature of our tasks will be fundamentally changed. And I think just one, and look, I'm not comparing a bank teller job to an academic job, but in many respects, the job of a bank teller is actually quite illustrative in terms of, to give you a bit of a sense of how jobs might change. We have almost as many, in fact, we have many more bank tellers today than we did 50 years ago. But when we actually look at what bank tellers do today, they do fundamentally different things to what they were doing 50 years ago. 50 years ago, about 80% of everything they do it was counting money. It's basically counting money. Now, the Japanese bank teller, apart, where they still do quite a lot of counting money, but in terms of, there are very few bank tellers today. Well, bank tellers spend, yes, some of their time, but a very, very small portion of their time actually counting money. 20 years ago, when many of us were, 30 years ago, when many of us were at university, the bank teller was fundamentally about opening and closing simple accounts, consumer accounts. It was about creating the bank. You went to get your checkbook, you went to get your savings account. It was all about, as it were, the opening and closing account management. Today, 10 years ago to today, it's largely been around customer service and sales. Given what's coming out of the Royal Commission in Australia, we might say that there is some learnings in terms of how the sales could have been done slightly differently. But again, backed by data analysis. In the future, we see the role of a bank teller, that there will be fewer of them. It will largely only be about complex sales with a more limited branch footprint. But again, tellers have not gone away as a job, as a career, but fundamentally changed in terms of how they spend their time, how they interact. And our view is that for 60% of society, this will be the narrative. Their job won't go away, but it will be fundamentally reshaped in terms of the tasks that go away and the new tasks that get created. And in many respects, that's a very positive story. complex sales, customer service is actually a lot more fulfilling than counting money all day. So there is an opportunity that we will be able to significantly upgrade, as it were, the underlying utility, the underlying enjoyment and meaning and fulfilment that work offers, and we can automate the drudgery and the much more repetitive tasks. Again, this picture just shares you what looks across all job categories, as it were, and shows you just, as it were, the Pareto of how many jobs actually can be completely automated versus which share of the job is automated. So you can see at the top, there's only about 1% of careers that can be completely eliminated, given the nature of what we know about AI and the future of work. At the bottom, however, there's only 2% of jobs that virtually have no impact. No prizes for guessing, but actually senior politicians with the least change by AI and the future of work. Now, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board with our analysis to see how we could change that. But again, it was interesting that senior politicians, senior legislators were the folk who had very little of their job, their day-to-day job, impacted by the future of work. Again, you can see the 48%. Most of us are going to have more than 40% of our jobs significantly reshaped by what the future of work. So when you look at the distribution of that, you see it really is a story of change and a reshaping of how we spend our time, as opposed to more of an elimination story in its entirety. Now, this is a little bit of the wake-up call. This is for me the deep, sharp and take a breath page. And what this shows is we've actually used some modelling that we did largely for the US that we've then actually found a way to, as it were, reshape that for different economies. So we haven't done this bottom up for New Zealand and Australia. It's based on taking the US economy and then finding some ways to try and make that appropriate and model in a New Zealand context. But it essentially gives you the redeployment scenarios. And the top scenario is essentially the do-nothing scenario. That's when we assume that there's no change in policy settings, there's really no change at all. And you can see that unemployment gets up close to the double digit again before it comes back to that long-term picture that I painted in 2030. However, we do think, look, there's no way that there's not some adjustment. But you can see certainly in what I describe as the good and the very good and the good scenario, we get into a world where either we track what history would have been, or really, given the margin of what we've seen over history, very little change from what would be accepted as just normal volatility in and around our employment rate. But for me, that really is the deep intake of breath page, that if we do nothing, we will end up seeing levels of unemployment that certainly as a nation we've been very unfamiliar with in our lifetimes, and the social challenges that this will create when we overlay some of the issues that I'll frame around inequality that is coming as well. So that ends up being a challenge from the unemployment perspective. And it throws up some challenges for all of us in terms of more structural challenges, in terms of how we think about our society, how we think about our economy, how we think about how we actually believe as citizens the sort of country we want to be part of. The first thing is, are our institutions really fit for purpose? When you look back in time, whenever we had a major dislocation of this type, New Zealand actually, and a few other smaller nations, we often were the first to innovate around some new institutions that were created to respond to the problem. One of the things that I'm quite proud of, my great-grandfather was an academic, a gentleman, Edward Tregear, but he ended up being essentially our first Minister for Labour in the late 18th century in New Zealand, and actually at that time, late 19th century, sorry, in New Zealand. And actually at that time we ended up having, for 30 years, basically no unemployment in New Zealand. It was sort of no strikes, no meaningful labour disruption, because he and his team ended up creating essentially the first labour placement agency anywhere on earth. They essentially created the world's first job centre that matched opportunities and created incentives to move folk around the country and created some incentives. And when I look at, then actually interestingly, another graduate of this fine university, Dean Nairi Woods, who's the Dean of the Badabotnick School of Government at Oxford, her great-grandfather actually was the 4th Minister of Labour, who put in place a number of significant innovations in response to the Great Depression, when New Zealand again innovated. And I think we, as a nation, have an opportunity. We will need some new institutions to deal particularly with the reskilling challenge that is coming. Do our education systems sufficiently cater for the future? The head of the education practice in the OECD made the statement that 80% of what we teach children today at primary and secondary level is for jobs that will not exist in 10 years' time. That's a pretty confronting claim. 80% of what we teach children today in primary and secondary school is for jobs that will not exist in 10 years' time. Do we really have education systems that are equipping our young people for the challenges that are coming? Is the public and the private sector investing sufficiently in retraining and reskilling? Again, I'll share some numbers with you that actually as a nation, we really are in the lagging category, that we've cut pretty significantly in terms of the overall spend and the individual spend that we are making in, as it were, investing in human capital in terms of the training that we're putting in place. So are we doing enough? Is the quantum of resource right? And also, are we providing folk with the right resource? How can we solve the wealth inequality that will grow as automation impacts low to mid-level jobs? I don't think this is something we can just, as it were, hope and pray that it will all work out. I think the numbers I will share with you, certainly I find them quite cathartic. We need to do something about this. And I think at the moment it's solvable. I think in a generation it may not be solvable. We may be levels with such endemic levels of inequality that we actually find ourselves as a society, as a country, in a very problematic place, that it takes sometimes 3-4 generations before you can actually correct those issues. So those are some of the challenges that I think we're going to need to deal with, and let me just share some ideas that I think might be relevant. Firstly, just in terms of dimensioning, assume we do nothing. For Australia and New Zealand, I just give you a sense of what the burden might be in terms of just the current commitments that we make to citizens. If you look in Australia with Centrelink and in New Zealand with WINS, currently we support in Australia about 700,000 people, in New Zealand 130,000 people. That costs about $1.7 billion in New Zealand, nearly $10 billion in Australia. If you play out that large scenario that I showed you, you can see that in Australia it grows to 5 times, both Australia and New Zealand, grows to 5 times the number that will need support, and the payout will end up being 2.5 times what it costs today. So I don't think certainly when you look at the degrees of freedom that were announced in the budget, it didn't sound like we had that sort of spare change to be able to put into our system. So again, I think reasonably confronting if we do nothing. The sorts of just fiscal implications, not to mention the personal and human cost that lies behind this. And again, many people are writing that our education system overall is not fit for purpose. Again, I'm not a specialist in this area, but certainly many of my colleagues and several of the folk that I interact with make an argument that the future of work is going to actually require, certainly at the tertiary level, a significant movement towards high-end vocational. In terms of, so just one thing, we are going to need less doctors going forward, but we will actually need many more highly skilled technicians that are running the sophisticated diagnostic and therapeutic technology that will exist. So needing to significantly redeploy resources towards high-end vocational, and actually a view that a rediscovery of many of the great traditions of academia, in terms of philosophy, in terms of, I consider engineering to be one of the great traditions of academic history, but really a rediscovery of some of the great academic traditions. Creativity and innovation weren't ideas or pedagogies discovered yesterday. They've been around for thousands of years. And in many respects, we need to be opening young people's eyes again to many of those great academic traditions. So many people argue that the education system of the future is a little bit more of a polarisation, of a rediscovery of the great academic traditions and a focus on higher end vocational. And if you look at New Zealand, we actually, if you apply a balanced scorecard, we do actually a half. I know you hear a lot about the trades have gone away and we don't have apprenticeships like we used to have. In many respects, New Zealand actually doesn't do too bad a job around trades. The challenge where we do a poor job is around high-end vocational. And if you look at the Switzerlands, the Germanys, the Scandinavian nations, they are, with their two-tier education systems, they're actually extremely good around that high-end vocational. And really, New Zealand doesn't have an engine that really works in the way that I think it needs to around high-end vocational. I mentioned before just around the quantum of what we spend in human capital. The retraining, the repurposing, the equipping with new skills. We are going to need to invest. That's not going to happen by itself. And when you look at, again, over the last 20 odd years, you can see that New Zealand's up there in terms of the degree to which we've cut our spending by about 25% in terms of the amount of spending in and around what we put into training. Again, no surprise that countries like Switzerland and Denmark are those that have actually increased their spend. It does actually pay off investing in human capital. Even the Aussies are better than us on this one. This is the chart that I find the most confronting. When I do look at the challenges going out, and what we've done here is just showing of all of the jobs that are going to be created and destroyed by decile of income band. And you can see that the jobs that go are largely the jobs in the middle. And then we recreate with high-end jobs, which is a good story. And by the way, overall, it's actually a positive story that the average goes up when you do the mix. But again, when you look at the data scientists, when you look at these next generation professions, they are going to be well paid. They are going to be highly skilled and well paid professions. Sadly, the jobs that go away are many of the good, what you would describe as good, old-fashioned, middle-class, middle-income jobs. They are going to go away. There'll be quite a significant growth in largely care jobs, healthcare jobs, personal care jobs. We're going to see quite a significant growth in those, but they are lower paid jobs. And therefore, when you actually run that equation over time, we end up having an inequality problem that is an order of magnitude worse than what we have today. And again, I don't think any of us should be sanguine given the inequality challenges that we have today, let alone overlaying that picture that's going to unfold. So we need some interventions, we need some solutions. This will not fix itself. The market will not fix itself, this problem by itself. So the challenge I would have is, what can we do collectively, given the academic pedigree in this room, given, I think, the resilience and the entrepreneurialism and the innovation of New Zealanders, and the smallness, the agile nature of who we are as a country. What could we actually do to tackle some of these challenges together? Well, here are a few thoughts. Firstly, I think our corporates need to step up to the plate around reskilling. One of the things that my colleagues and I are putting out there, we argue that actually it's time in our history when corporates actually adopted, business leaders more broadly, adopted a business Hippocratic oath. Analogous to the medical profession, that there is actually a Hippocratic oath that all business leaders actually sign up to, that is as seriously taken, as deeply felt as the medical Hippocratic oath, in and around the need for reskilling and the need for reskilling to be done right. And in fairness, I actually think there is an appetite out there. I do have the privilege of serving some of the world's leading chief executives. And I've never seen fear in their eyes like I see today. When they see not dissimilar presentations, a lady that I have, a senior executive, chief executive that I work for at the moment, she oversees an organisation of 250,000 people. She knows that organisation today is 250,000 people. When she has run the numbers, they can basically run that global organisation with 5,000 people. The sheer sense of, what can I do? So I think many leaders are truly up for this. The one thing I'd also say is, reskilling in itself is not just the simple answer. I don't know if any of you had the privilege of the lady Amy Goldstein, who was the author of the Financial Times Book of the Year, Financial Times McKinsey Book of the Year, although the Financial Times selects it, we pay for the prize that they selected. She wrote a book called Janesville. And Janesville is a quintessential town in the US that was home of one of the largest General Motors factories in the US. And as a result of the financial crisis, this town, the factory closed. And it's an incredible narrative around the future of work and what can happen to an entire town when the future of work is not managed as well as it could. But one of the most confronting things that you have a number of the local community leaders, they undertook a massive reskilling program in Janesville. Huge amount of federal government spend, huge amount of energy. And many of the community leaders really feel deeply scarred as a result of that reskilling effort, because now that we have the data, again, the factory closed in 2009, those folk that enrolled in the reskilling programs are now significantly behind those that went straight into other jobs. So they talk about the Janesville double whammy, that not only did these people lose their jobs, but we sold them something in reskilling and retraining that would take them to a better place. We've actually taken them to a worse place. We rose their expectations, we disappointed them. And the big learning they had is they did reskilling disconnected from the business community. They lived in this parallel universe that they had the employees, the providers and employers that were all in these parallel universes that never actually collaborated, never actually talked to each other or actually reskilled people towards areas where there were actual jobs. So the reason that I say it's imperative for corporates, I don't think government or institute, even if they had the resources, even if they do it of their own esteem, it just won't work out in the right direction. We need new public-private partnerships to reshape ministries of labour and tertiary funding. TRR and Flexicurity are two Scandinavian institutions. They have the highest redeployment rate in the world. So those Scandinavian, it's Denmark and Sweden, they don't have the lowest unemployment rate in the world, but if you look at someone that becomes unemployed and the pace at which they get re-employed, Sweden and Denmark, through these two institutions, are the best at redeploying folk quickly. Also, I do think we will need some new transition mechanisms, some new ways to how do we actually provide support to folk that are being transitioned. Now, UBI has been talked about, the Universal Basic Income, and that's been piloted in a number of countries. However, we would also say that doesn't seem to work all that well. Finland has actually rolled back its UBI program because they felt the incentives just didn't work very well. The Singaporeans have introduced a lifelong learning credit, which seems to be a much better solution. But we are going to have to come up with some mechanisms to transition folk. We cannot leave people, as it were. We need a safety net that helps transition. And then also, I do think that the public sector institutions just dramatically need to reshape and repurpose themselves. The German Labour Agency has, with no change in policy settings, been able to reduce unemployment by 1.5% by introducing what they call case management technology. So rather than treating you as part of a demographic, they actually treat you as an individual that they track along and make customised segment of one interventions to make sure that you're getting the right help, the right skill, the right support where you need it, as opposed to treating you as a white female between the ages of 25 and 40, or a Polynesian male between the ages of 50 and 60. They actually treat you as, Tuakau, Tupai, or Andrew Grant. You're actually an individual citizen, as opposed to a demographic. You can actually get very significant improvements. So some challenges that I also had the privilege of giving a not dissimilar presentation to the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum nearly a month ago with our Prime Minister and Malcolm Turnbull. And a couple of challenges that I said also I believe as a nation, or joint nations, that we could potentially sign up for. One is, we have two of the best productivity commissions in the world. Why don't we set both of them, the Australian and the New Zealand Productivity Commission? How do we make sure that we don't miss this opportunity? AI in the future of work is this once in a lifetime, once in a many lifetime opportunity. We can't miss it. We can't not restart the productivity engine that we've let atrophy and grow silent in Australia and New Zealand. Secondly, again, for our companies, why wouldn't we make reskilling programs a matter of public disclosure? It's in the annual report, it's in the public listings. Make it transparent in terms of are companies living up to their obligations to make sure that their employees are being equipped and managed for the future. Make it a point of competitive difference. Let the competitive forces flow that actually our companies end up being amongst the best in the world around that. Secondly, could we closer economic relations, when it was created 40 years ago, was genuinely world class, was at the frontier of what a free trade agreement looked like. When you look at actually what are going to be the things that really matter, the connective tissue between countries going forward, data flows will actually be one of the most important things that matter. In many respects, more important than the flow of goods, maybe even more important than the flow of services in the future. And one interesting thing about AI is everyone thought the basis of competition was going to be around the technology and the quality of algorithms. What we're learning is that the real competitive advantage is going to be the size and integrity of data sets. The size and integrity of data sets. And China has a massive advantage over the rest of the world. Its transactional data sets today are 30 times the US. Its healthcare data sets are likely to be 50 times the US. So the advantage that will give China over the rest of the world in terms of the quality, integrity and scale of the data sets is massive. For machine learning today, particularly deep learning, we need at least 10 million itemised data points to be able to get to human intelligence. So to have an algorithm and machine learning that matches the intelligence of a human, we need about 10 million individually tagged data sets. It doesn't take a high quality engineering graduate to know that with 4.5 million people, there's a lot of data sets where we ain't going to get to 10 million. So actually working with our Australian brethren is going to make a lot of sense for a huge number of data sets to put us in the game. So could we reshape CER in that direction? Again, for the academic quality of pedigree, AI for good. When you actually look at the nature of what AI is, we actually could have a crack at solving human trafficking. There's a lot about climate change that AI can get at. There's certainly, when you look at the nature of criminal supply chains and the globality of that, AI is being used and can be used. So how do we launch AI for good? That we really, at the frontier of what AI is being deployed against, are some of these wicked problems that humanity is currently facing. Could New Zealand and Australia, could we lead the world? Why couldn't we lead the world in and around some of that research? Also, I do think this point around Centrelink in Australia wins in New Zealand. We do need to innovate around our institutions. They are good institutions, but they're not unique to the world. They're not great institutions. And I think we're in a moment in our history where we actually need public institutions where we innovate at the level of what some of our great-grandfathers did in the late 19th century and in the mid-20th century. And also, should we actually, for business leaders, but also as a society, should we actually just put out there a commitment that no one gets left behind? As a society that actually, we won't let anyone get left behind, and we will reskill and make sure that everyone gets brought along. And I think, as Kiwis, there's actually something about that fear go, in that sense that that's who we are as people, and that's the humanity that we need to live. Because I do think, if we don't, I have had, and at one level I apologise for being slightly emotional, but I have been to many of these North American towns and many of these places where the future of work has got ahead of steam and these things haven't been put in place. And the human cost is confronting. It's really, really confronting. And I don't think any of us want that for our kids, and we don't want that for our neighbours, and we don't want that for our society. So, it's a little bit of a tour of my view of AI and the future of work, some of just the underlying nature of what's going to happen, good news on productivity, within our control and with our hand story around deployment, something to really keep us awake at night around inequality, and some real challenges and opportunities. But again, I think as a nation, and maybe as joint nations with Australia, we face a bit of an Anzac moment in terms of where I think we really could actually be at our very best in terms of responding to this challenge. So, hey, thank you so much for your graciousness and listening. I'd love to take questions if we have some time. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm going to moderate the questions, but just a couple of words to say some things while you think of what those really good questions are. First, just to introduce myself, I'm Rod McNaughton, Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, and I'd like to convey the good wishes from our Dean, Jane Godfrey, who couldn't be here this evening because she's attending alumni events in Silicon Valley in Los Angeles, where, of course, many of these things are coming from. So I'm sure she will be bringing back some excellent learning as well. You can imagine that universities are one of the key players and agents in this, and we think about this every day. And in this room, we have educators and researchers, and we also have a number of alumni from our business school. And this is the beginning of a conversation, I think, and it's the people in this room working together who need to carry this kind of conversation forward, and that came out very strongly in your speech. So thank you for being here, but also to McKinsey for funding research like this, and in such a balanced way, I think, that causes us to think not in terms of individual companies, but in terms of what this means to us as nations and as societies. So with that, I think we have about 10 minutes or so, and I'm sure we have lots of great questions, and the keen people have their hand up already.
Andrew,
Yes.
Do you have any insight into why New Zealand lags in productivity? Have you done any initial work on that?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think coming back to some of those things that I mentioned earlier, the largest challenge we have is just the nature of the distribution of firm size in New Zealand, because we are disproportionately small and medium sized. Again, as is so well said, I think it was actually Helen Clark that said, we are a land of blokesses and blokes that own a job. That makes it harder to have deployed some of these, other, technologies. There is just also being small, the inability to have competitive intensity. The other nature, and look, this is a whole other lecture in itself, but New Zealand also has a congestion and capacity utilisation problem that's deeply embedded. If you take our dairy industry, people forget that we produce all of our milk in 3.5 months of the year, whereas the Northern Hemisphere has much more of an animal productivity model that is distributed across. If we could find a way to have cows, grass that grows across it, we would spread that dramatically. Just because of the, if you look at tourism, we've also got one of the most seasonally driven tourism industries in the world. That's, just look at Auckland. Auckland, if you look at, I know the traffic engineers, but the congestion peaks relative to off-peak, I think that Auckland is one of the most extreme cities in the world. So the other thing with our productivity, we've never actually cracked what I describe as capacity utilisation, to actually have all of our capital, all of our infrastructure working for us, more days of the year in a more even way. So I would say that's another big challenge for engineers and the business school folk is, how do we actually find out? And for me, it's a no-brainer that why Auckland doesn't have a half-decent congestion pricing, congestion management is the most obvious sort of idea. There's no city in the world, no matter what infrastructure spend, that doesn't work without congestion pricing. There are actually a number of next-generation genetic technologies. We could solve the challenge we have in our dairy industry is ryegrass stops growing at 9 degrees. We could actually lower that thermostat to 4 degrees. We have a fructose limit at 45. We only feed our cows to about 65% of their genetic potential. We could get the fructose content up to 45, 50. We get grass growth 9.5 months of the year. Actually don't need fertiliser. No phosphate, no nitrogen runoff. So again, I think there are some of these, I'm simplifying some of those things a little bit, but I think there are, but not a lot by the way, in terms of, so I think there is some thinking we could do in some other areas around productivity, but it really is largely around firm size. We don't help ourselves by not investing in R&D and not investing in capital as well.
We can go to the other side of the room.
With that, you mentioned data flows being potentially more important than goods and services in the future,
Yes.
and humans often being the source of those data flows.
Yeah.
How do you think that might change our political and economic systems such as capitalism into the future, or our focus on capitalism into the future?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, but McKinsey did, our Global Institute did a piece of research 5 years ago looking at the flows that will really matter. And again, historically, and all free trade agreements were really wedded and conceived in this world of goods being the primary flows. We kind of updated them to incorporate services and financial flows. But in the future, to your point, it's going to be data flows, it's going to be research flows, it's going to be human capital that increasingly really drive how economies and societies actually model it. Look, I don't know the exact answer to you. I do think we need more the ability to have more human capital flow. I actually work with the Estonian government, and Estonian has this notion of why do we think of citizens as being physical citizens? They've launched this notion of we only have a couple of million physical citizens, but why can't we create 20 million digital citizens? Why can't we actually have citizens that have a connection with Estonia because of their data flows, their digital identity? So I think there's some really interesting thinking that can be done. I don't have all of the answers. I would love that New Zealand, and even a challenge that I've made to Phil Goff in with, if you look at this connectivity, the connectivity is actually less between countries and more between cities. So the flows between cities are growing at about 5-6 times faster than the flows between countries. So why couldn't Auckland create free trade agreements that are next generation with the 3 or 4 cities that are the most important to our connected history going forward? Around, what it means to be a digital citizen, what it means to how we connect those things. So again, I don't have all of the answers, but interestingly, when I had the privilege of leading McKinsey in China, it was the Chinese that would come to the table and say, why do we have to deal with free trade agreement that was, yesterday's thing, and we just update from, old-fashioned. Why not start 100 years forward? So the mayor of Beijing has launched a 100-year plan to make Beijing the scientific capital of the world. And it's not, silly stuff. It's actually really thoughtful about what are going to be the scientific flows that you nurture today that will make Beijing the scientific capital of the world in 100 years' time. And that's where I think we could again be at the forefront of thinking. Is it going to be more about connective tissue between cities? What are these flows that really matter? What does a digital citizen mean relative to physical citizenry? How can we be at the forefront of doing that? So again, I know, sorry, very conceptual, but I challenge, I think New Zealand, we could be at the forefront of some of that thinking. CER, when you look with the passage, CER was the highest quality free trade agreement ever signed. It was genuinely, at the forefront of its time. I think we could, and certainly between us and the Australians, there's no reason we couldn't actually create a CER type arrangement in the digital world, or even between Sydney and Auckland as a start.
I've got lots of good hands here, but anybody in the back? Do I get some things in the back? I'll get in the middle rank. Yep, you.
Given the level of change in technologies in the last 5 years, do you think there's a sense that we might be actually underestimating the level of automation because of the advances which can be made in artificial intelligence and machine learning? There could be a really step-up change. Yeah. So something where we are envisaging, say, 40% automation could actually be severely underestimated.
Well, I think it's an excellent point. Again, you clearly get a sense of my New Zealand roots, so it's very difficult for me to say nice things about Australians. But there's a gentleman, Ian Morrison, who became the Professor of the Future at the Institute of the Future in Santa Fe. And he made a statement, he's claimed as being the author, I'm sure he stole it from someone else, but he made a statement, whenever it comes to technology intersecting with humanity, we always overestimate the impact in the short term and fundamentally underestimate the impact in the long term. And my own view is I think there are lots of challenges to AI today. The fact that we have to label every individual piece of data, the fact that regulators are demanding that we actually explain the algorithms. I don't know about you, but explaining basic economic policy is often difficult to legislators, let alone next generation AI algorithms. AI and machine learning is incredibly hyper-specialised. We can't, so even the notion of singularity, we can get to human intelligence on specifics. It's very difficult to generalise that, and they tend to be very specialised use cases. So I can present lots of reasons why I think there are many, many roadblocks around automation, but I do think in the long term we're totally going to crack those. And also, even in New Zealand, I don't feel it appropriate to mention some of the companies' names, but if I was to say what country has more, that has 3 times as many autonomous vehicles as all of California, what would your answer be? What country has 3 times as many autonomous vehicles as California? Australia. Largely on the mine sites and the ports that they have, but again, they've been running autonomous vehicles for, so I think it'll be a bit differential, it'll happen in different ways. The reason I don't want to mention company names, New Zealand already has 12 lights out factories. And lights out factories, if you don't have humans, you can turn off the lights. So New Zealand's actually at the forefront on some of these things. So I think my own read is that I think it is pushing forward, and what we've described here is possible. But there's human latency in terms of, I don't know about you, but I drive a pretty old car just because I like it. And I don't feel the need, yes, there's a more economic, it probably actually makes more economic sense for me to get a new car, but I just like my car. And I don't really want to change so there's all of those human, as it were, stickiness factors that I think will take a bit longer, but I'm certain that we probably underestimate what the world will actually be. And it's interesting, this exercise for the Mayor of Beijing, really trying to think out 100 years until your head hurts, is quite difficult in terms of, so I think again, in my view, we can't even imagine in terms of, I think, for some of the places we might get in a positive sense.
Yeah, clearly we have the thought leaders here at the center. The lady right here.
Thank you. I'm from financial services industry. I know quite a fear that my job might demolished in 10 years' time. So what would you suggest for me to reskill, for me to actually get into this game? And also, would you actually recommend to me to dump my current job and go into another job?
Well, could I reckon there's a lot of engineers in the room. Maybe you should introduce yourself to one of them. Help you talk about what would be a more prospective career. Look, I think if you look at the accounting profession, I do think the accounting profession and the legal profession, and again, I'm not comparing you to bank tellers, but I do think it's going to be very much like what I described. I think your profession will be, if you look at the legal profession, discovery is going away. There are already, I think, 250 meaningful startups in automation of legal discovery. Likewise, in terms of the automation of the bookkeeping part of accounting, has been happening for some time and it's going to happen more and more. So I think essentially in accounting, in my view, your profession is going to be one of those that really will be the most change. And clearly there's a whole lot of next generation consulting, advisory, value added that accountants are incredibly well positioned. Some people are doing some of the discussions I've had with the large accounting firms. They actually see themselves as the natural owner of AI for the simple reason that if you take a place like New Zealand, the first relationship as a firm that you tend to have is not with a consultant, is not with a merchant bank, is not with an engineer, it's with an accountant. So they actually see that maybe they could actually be the brokers because they own that relationship, their first introduction with a firm. Maybe they could actually be at the forefront of AI and introducing those services too. So after you've introduced yourself to an engineer tonight, then maybe that would be the sort of study in travel. The other thing, I don't know if you've heard of, I had the privilege of hosting Sebastian Thrun in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago. So Sebastian created MOOCs. If you're familiar with MOOCs, he was the professor of AI at Stanford University that put his courses online and then became somewhat, as he describes, the most hated professor in America when his top student at Stanford rated 493 in the rankings of the MOOCs that he created. But he then went on to be the CEO of Google X, and he's now the CEO of Udacity, which is the largest retraining program. But there is online retraining, reskilling that he offers for accountants to upskill you to accounting, data scientists, and interpreters. So, look, I only get 15% commission.
Okay, I think we'll do one more, and then there will be opportunity to talk with you informally afterwards.
Andrew, thanks for a fantastic presentation. The Economist, in their recent feature on AI, raised, I think, a really important issue about the reduction in competition, potentially, versus where individual organisations can achieve superiority that will eliminate, and we see that obviously Google, Facebook, networks, and so forth. I mean, how much is this going to be an issue that the competitive landscape is going to change dramatically as well?
Well, I think it's an incredibly important question, and with each new era of technology, we seem to create more of an increasing returns dynamic that creates even more of a winners take all environment. And by the way, it's not just that when you look at sport, Tiger, your local golfer or opera singer used to earn, the village catchment area, and now Tiger Woods kind of scoops the entire pool. So it's not just in technology per se, but technology does tend to create these increasing returns issues. So, I mean, there's no doubt there will be and has to be a regulatory response. We have to get our old ways around. So I think there will be a regulatory response, and I think regulators are starting to get their hand around it. I'm sure most of you, I can't believe the role I have at McKinsey. I lead our Risk and Audit Committee. GDPR is consuming a lot of my life today. I can't believe I'm involved in 11 small not-for-profits that now have their GDPR, policy response. So I think there's going to be regulation in lots of areas that we'll have to do. And some of it does need to be there in terms of, and I think many of us have found that Facebook, Cambridge Analytica revelations deeply confronting in terms of what they are. So I think that's a big issue. The two other issues I do think we hinted at this explainability point, I think is important. At one level, regulators do need to understand what's actually in the black box. And I think that I've been in some very painful conversations between regulators and the data scientists, where it was kind of, no one could actually really explain where the machine learning had got to. Regulators are not going to, society's not going to stand for that. So I think how we create explainability and transparency is going to be an issue. One of the issues that is actually, in many respects, the hardest is this one of embedded bias. Algorithms are actually really, really good at racial profiling. And also as society we do evolve and we create new ideas. In many respects, we don't want to take yesterday's ideas and embed them forever in terms of the algorithm. So how we actually de-bias these algorithms is not trivial, particularly given the magic of machine learning is that it learns from data and learns from history. So, the de-biasing, and then you also don't want to make someone play God, that you create sort of, as it were, a God gene that sort of directs where the algorithm to go going forward. So I think those are, challenging questions that, I haven't yet heard great answers in terms of, and in fairness, the folks at DeepMind, the discussion at Davos, I think people are pretty humble and open about these are real issues, and we don't have elegant solutions that are on the table to them. And I also don't think we can here just sort of see no evil, but just hope for the best, because if you embed a little problem with the way these things work, it becomes exponentially bigger with time. So it's an excellent question.
Thank you. I'm just going to call upon my colleague Jason Ingham from engineering to close.
Thanks. So, as you heard, it's my role to close out the session today. One of the themes I think Andrew touched on was relationships. And we have a relationship going back to the late 1980s, he and I, when we were both in the same class together. a couple of young civil engineers not knowing where our lives will take us. So we've wound the clock forward 30 years. And I must admit there was a couple of themes that came out tonight. One was this notion of confronting. So in our department, we've been looking forward another 30 years, trying to figure out what the world will look like when our young graduates are now sort of at the career point that Andrew and I are both at. And he referred to a sucking in the breath moment, but I sucked in a slightly different breath at a slightly different moment, because we've been looking out there like 30 years, and now I see it's like only 6 years away. So we've got to do a lot more catch up. I can only hope that we've made the mistake that others make of over-predicting the short term and under-predicting the long term. That might be our one chance. But engineering, I think we can sort of characterize as a discipline that does work with data and does have some aspects of it as a sort of formulaic procedural stuff, and that was the categories that are definitely in threat. And so we as a department, and in fact as an entire faculty, we're going through quite a comprehensive curricular review currently, recognising, I think, that in future thought leadership and creativity are going to be the issues that are going to be more and more essential. And I think that came out rather well in Andrew's presentation. So I think because we sort of saw at least 3 different scenarios of pessimistic and kind of neutral and optimistic, hopefully we can all take away the optimistic scenario at the end of it all. In closing, I really just want to thank you, Andrew, for a wonderfully stimulating presentation. It was said already, but I want to remind you again that directly after this, there are going to be refreshments served outside, and you're all welcome to stay and mingle, and obviously Andrew's staying as well, so you'll be able to have some more one-on-one with him. And then as a final close, I have here a small token of appreciation from the 2 faculties. So thank you very much.
Sometimes you can tell. Yeah, well, it's still recording, apparently. So we can start recording now.
Okay, yeah, start. Yep.